up and we'll kick off the session?
Yes, I'll do that right away. Okay, hopefully.
All right.
That's coming through.
Yes, you are good to go.
Great stuff. Thank you, Justin. Right. Okay. So welcome everyone to Microsoft 365 Saturday, Bangalore 2020. And it's my immense pleasure to be here presenting online. I would have loved to be there in person, but fingers crossed, maybe next year. And so I just want to say a big thanks to Justin, Kamlesh, Nick, and Vijay for making this event happen, and obviously a lot of good sessions and speakers. I would have loved to have been able to tune in, but obviously some time zone difficulties, so I had to kind of give it a bit of a miss on that. But again, thanks to the sponsors for even making this event happen. Without them, some of these events would not even take place. And so if you haven't had a chance, then please do check them out on their website as well. So hopefully they might solve some of your problems as well. For those of you who are not aware, I'm Chirag Patel. I live and work in London, UK. techchirag.com is the best way to get hold of me, and you'll find my social media links and everything on the blog site. But I work with Patel Consulting, and I generally work with everything in Microsoft 365 space, Teams, SharePoint, which is where I pretty much originated, with SQL Server, DBA duties and responsibilities. So generally, I tend to keep up with the ever-changing pace of the Microsoft tech through the certifications, but also follow the IT industry as well through the Chartered IT Professional code of conduct that I've been following for about 10 years now. But yeah, I think in addition to that, I'm just recently been awarded as an MVP, but that just basically means that I speak a lot in a lot of events and generally just share things that I learn or I come across through attending other people's sessions. And I also organize Microsoft 365 UK user group, which happens every month. So we got next one coming up next Wednesday. So if you can, do sign up on that one as well. But in the spare time, if I do get any, then as I mentioned, I speak at a lot of events, and these are some of the events I've spoken over at in the last few years. And you'll find the links to slides, recordings, everything through those links as well. And I'll also share slides for this session as well later on today. So do check out on that as well. Right. So I've got about, I think, around about 40 minutes, I would say. It's ever so difficult, not just this topic around the security compliance in Microsoft Teams, but just generally to try and unpack everything within 45 minutes can be a bit challenging. So it'll be exciting to see. This is a brand new session that I've put together, and namely I'm going to be touching on a few topics there. But firstly, I think it's whilst we and 115 million of us on a daily basis who are using Microsoft Teams, but Teams is our front gateway to it. But obviously, we do have other areas that that covers as part of the Teams through Microsoft 365 services. So we'll take a brief look at that. But also from a security compliance perspective, where do the responsibilities lie? Which kind of business functions are involved with it? Yes, IT tends to be the go-to for everything. So we'll look at that briefly, how to kind of balance that out. But also, if you're new to Microsoft Teams, especially with the conditions of this year, you may have just jumped onto Teams and not maybe realizing other areas of the platform that basically can sort of have some doors open, if you like. So we can look at some of those areas in terms of just to see what your state of data looks like and how some of the controls and policies that we will look at in greater depth around the sensitivity labels, DLPs, and some of the examples of what the end user experience looks like for some of these feature areas. It is needless to kind of say that there are about 25, according to Microsoft. If you go into the Microsoft Teams website, there's about 25 features that they kind of actively encouraging for every organization to take a look into that. So we'll look at that as a brief overview of what those are. Okay, so in terms of Microsoft Teams, and yes, we all, I'm not going to go in the great depths of this because there's plenty of introductions out there. But when you look at it from as a platform perspective, yes, we have our conversations, our chats, whether they ad hoc or through the channel messages, through a particular team chat space that we may have, and then obviously working behind the scenes with SharePoint, which is where all your files, your collaboration experiences around files all get exposed into your Microsoft Teams. And then you've got the ability to obviously, the rich ecosystem of, I believe, or around 800 to 900 apps that you can integrate with your Microsoft Teams. Some of them are free, some of them are chargeable. And so you're able to kind of customize your chat space to your heart's content. And then with that, and not to say that this is exclusive to Microsoft Teams, but you have the general security and compliance capabilities that's available natively within Microsoft 365, but also available through Microsoft Teams as well. So it kind of makes that all-rounded Teams experience in terms of its security and compliance perspective. It is worth pointing out, for those of you who may not be aware, that Microsoft Teams does not stand by itself. It is heavily dependent upon something called Microsoft 365 Group, which basically is your cross-membership service, if you like. It has its own security group through your permissions and the authorization that's controlled through that group membership, but also being able to rely on Exchange email calendars, being able to bring some of the experiences around Planner and SharePoint team side above all, which is where your OneNote resides. And also now, I think as of last month or thereabouts, you're now going to have recordings for your Microsoft Teams meetings residing in SharePoint as well. So, there's all that kind of changes that's happened, but it's worth bearing in mind that when you do go embark on the journey, or you already are on that journey for maintaining your security and compliance, then it's worth bearing in mind that whatever you do, you have a knock-on effect with Microsoft 365 group elements to it. So hopefully that kind of sets the scene for some of the things that we will see later on in the demos. But again, the $1 million, $1 million question is, who owns the security and compliance? And there are tons of research stats. You probably see this in the news every other day for some organizations who have had bad times, and some are having great time, with great control over their data, information, and people. But generally, the viewpoints are that IT is the central of it in terms of maintaining how when to press those switches, implementing those policies, but the design of it, which then basically derives from the requirements perspective, usually lies that from other areas. So from a business perspective at the C level, they just want things to be very simple, being able to just get on with the business goals and strategies that they have, and really obviously to minimize the disruption to the business, but having that balanced way of controlling exactly what stays in the organization and what goes out of the organizations in a controlled manner. You look at the security and compliance officers, if you like, in some organizations, they don't even have that. And IT is typically the endpoint for it, to be able to maintain not only just the administration for IT, but also the controls for it. And so therefore, security officers may just be interested from a security perspective, but the compliance part will be somebody from the business, and there may be a compliance monitoring unit who will be accessing some of those areas for their information governance. And so you have to kind of somehow bring this. And when I go into some of the organizations, and typically nobody's really the owner of it, and this is the one slide I have to put to them and say, look, the idea here is that, if you haven't got somewhere to start from, then you want to obviously design some of those policies. And I'll share some of those kind of, if you like, plain English policies that can be a good starting point to at least try and drive through the implementation for it. And with legal side of things, I usually find they're very quiet about it. They, when we try and find out when does this need to be implemented, And it's not just a one-off journey, because it's a constantly ongoing and improvement program. So it's never a, if you like, a kind of a one part of the phase of the project. And having said that, I have seen other organizations where they do treat security and compliance as a completely separate phase of a project. So first they roll out the collaboration capability, perhaps document management will be next, and then security and compliance is somewhere down the program. Clearly, it needs to be there right from the outset. Otherwise, you're just kind of storing a lot of work for yourselves later on. But as far as the employee is concerned, they just want to kind of do their job, work with their files, share them or what have you, and but be able to also still navigate around some of those controls that they get. So that's kind of the one side of it in terms of where in the organization, how the needs get translated into those capabilities that you may get from Microsoft Teams. Now, this is a long list, and again, there's a link over there you will see, and each of these capabilities are explained in detail with the subsequent links to it. But when you look at it, the first 7 points there, and this is really kind of, if you like, the privacy areas which you as a user, whether you're a meeting organizer or even a Microsoft Teams chat space owner, you have some control there in order to how to comply with your particular team for the work that you do, whether that's a project or whether you're a department manager or owner for it. So we'll just quickly browse through some of those things. And then when you look at the other areas of it, from 9 to pretty much all the way down to number 23, then you have an area of capabilities which covers not just from an identity perspective, in which the mandatory implementation there is that you have your multi-factor authentication enabled, not just for your staff, but also for your guest users who's going to access your Microsoft Teams chat space, but also being able to then work your way through your devices, and whether that's an option to just have your corporate domain joined PCs or devices or mobile apps, mobile devices, or perhaps maybe just the application that you may want to just allow your users or the guest to access that as well. So you have that kind of that granularity to maintain. Now, this is obviously not for day one. I wouldn't go and say that implement all these things before you even start using anything. But it's the question on your industry and the size of your organization, and more importantly, the culture for your organization in terms of how much of your employees are going to take this as a change to be able to have this successful implementation on that. But you can see there's also things like information barriers there. So if you have a kind of a research and development unit, which you don't want that to be sharing with, say, your sales or marketing folks, then you can actually have that divide. And of course, some of these are subject to licensing, and that's kind of another gray matter. And I will not kind of confess to that I know a lot of those, but there is a good link on that as well, which basically specifies exactly which capability and which feature of a particular capability is subject to E5 or A5 licensing or versus E3. And majority of the users I find in the organizations that I visit, they tend to be on E3. So sometimes they don't really bother to look at some of the premium capabilities that you get, and certainly from a threat protection perspective, or I think what they call these days now Microsoft 365 Defender, which everything is coming together. So there's a whole raft of changing landscape around the security and compliance features. We're only going to dive into some of those areas in that. But here's my version of what I tend to kind of put forward if I go and visit organizations who don't have any policies or really just have some features implemented like DLPs or data leak prevention, or whichever one of those. Then I tend to say, well, which one of these are actually ticked in your program for maintaining your security and compliance? And typically, this is not in any particular order, but it kind of makes sense that you kind of protect your authentication, your identity and device to begin with, but also the administrators or the contractors who may be working in your organization who accesses your systems, and then how do you make sure those are compliant? So what I tend to do is I tend to kind of work with this as a premise to kind of work from a simplest view as possible. And you will see the link there is designed for the business decision maker, which then clearly outlines exactly what each of these policy translates, and also which licensing, what licensing impact you may have if you do wish to decide to, say, implement something like the prevention identity management, or even some of the conditional access policies you may want to have implemented through your different rules and conditions of that. So it really kind of varies around that, but hopefully this kind of gives an idea to work from identity, device, information, and then the apps, of course, with that. But all very well that you have all the capabilities, all the features, and constantly going through all those change. You have your business that's changing rapidly, and especially in the current climate. So one thing for sure is, how do you kind of keep control of that? And so one of the ways to evaluate quickly is around some of your state of data, and you may be signed up with to kind of maintain your standards for your data, your networks, your devices, whatever it is, through a particular set of standards. And that could be either ISO 27001 or the GDPR in the EU, or any other standards. So one of the things you get with Compliance Manager is this is the end-to-end compliance solution. So this used to be called Compliance Score, and obviously that's been released, available generally now. So they've changed the name to Compliance Manager. But the fundamental premise here is to improve that posture, and we'll look at this in more detail as well. But also you have a set of controls from Microsoft which they have to adhere to, but then you have your controls. So it's always that shared responsibility to be able to understand in terms of what are your responsibility and what controls you have. And so some of this, you may do this already, maybe through another system. But if you're a small to medium-sized organization and don't have the luxury to work with third-party solutions, then this is a great solution to have that inside your Microsoft 365. But obviously that affects your Microsoft Teams as well. So let's take a look at that in some of this in action. So far we've had a look before we go into some of the depths of some of the labels side of things. So I'm going to go into my Teams chat space. So I've got a demo tenant here, Contoso Electronics, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So typically, first we'll kind of look at the end user experiences that we get. So if I go into a particular file, so if I go into Market Project Team, go into my general channel, and got a few files there, then nothing's, this is probably you're used to already. And here I've got a few, half a dozen files. I've got some metadata there as well. So I've got my retention label, which basically is part of my information governance. So I can apply that. That comes across very good in Teams. But also on the right-hand side, I've got sensitivity columns there as well. So I've got my data classified for this particular business plan as confidential finance label. Now, by default, this is normally not switched on from a SharePoint perspective. So it's a view inside your SharePoint in which you can pick and choose what to display. So then that comes across in your Teams. And especially if you got some of the critical files that resides in some of the teams, then that's probably one of the ways you want to switch that on through your views itself. So you can go into your views and then simply just turn that on. And then if I go into a particular, say, December expenses here, and I can do this in SharePoint if I wanted to, or in my Word Office applications, or I can simply just go in here, which is a web version in Teams. Then in my ribbon here, I've got on the right-hand side my sensitivity labels that's been published already. That comes across. So as an end user, as far as the end user is concerned, with the right training, of course, then they will know which ones to pick for. So in this case, if I pick confidential finance, in this case, I can't do that because it's relying on this desktop application. Now, there are certain, this does that because if some of the labels are encrypted, then that's not going to work over your web. So you need to have that desktop application. So this is what this is prompting here. But as far as that user experience goes, from a sensitivity level perspective, this is as much as it goes for them to be able to do that. But if they want to go into retention labels, then they can go into the SharePoint itself and being able to then tag a particular label to that. So that's okay if you have that program for maintaining that information governance aspects of it from within here itself. But that's from a user perspective. But if you're then an owner of your teams, then you've got a few options here in terms of controlling some of the privacy controls, if you like. So typically, you would be looking at some of the things around, like when you manage a team, and if you go into the settings side of things. So firstly, you may want to then control some of your guest permissions, what your guests can do. Can they create channels or update them? And so these are some of those things in there you can do. You also got the ability then to be able to maintain some of those channels in a way that you want that to pursue. So if I go into, say, the design channel options and manage that channel options there, I can control through that privacy method, if you like, whether everyone can post, or do I want to have moderation enabled on that so that I can actually review some of the chats that go on. So not all the teams that are deployed in that sort of manner. So some teams vary depending on what the requirements you're trying to serve. So if it's a big wide team, then you may want to have that moderation controls. And this is something you can do as a user, as a team owner, to maintain the standards for that particular team that you have. But if we go one level above to the Microsoft Teams admin area, so if I go into my Teams admin center, then one of the things you can do there is, and there's tons of policies that you have available there. So you've got not only just your Teams policy, but if I go into specifics around the meeting policy side of things, so when users are organizing any meetings, then you've got a set of things that you can actually control at the admin level. So then this affects all your Microsoft Teams. So, for example, like, can you allow Meet Now in channels? Do you want things like be able to allow Whiteboard or other applications in there? So you got some of those things there that you can actually control what kind of content through what medium you can share when doing your meeting presentations. But also from a guest perspective as well, is things like, do you want, when you send out a meeting, do you want everyone to just be admitted in the meeting automatically, or do you want just the organizer only? So then you have to click that every time, admit. So whatever your requirements may specify, you can control some of these privacy areas around that. So that's kind of through your policies. But also you got things like the Teams, not Teams apps, the org settings, and you got some of the guest access capabilities there as well. So be careful with this one. By default at the moment, when you're deploying Teams, this is off by default. I think come February or March, this is going to be on by default. So that's been communicated already by Microsoft around that. So if this is something that may concern you, then you may want to switch this off so that by default, any Teams you roll out don't have guest access enabled. But that's kind of the one area. And then the last but not least from this admin center I want to look at is the apps itself. So I go into not Teams settings. Where has it gone? Go back. No, not policy packages. Where is it gone? Can never find it when you want to look for it. Teams apps. So, before your users can download any particular apps to solve their requirements, so whichever you can review any of these. You can pick one of these things and look at the compliance side of things in terms of what they might do before you allow your users to actually have those apps, but also being able to then put permissions on some of these on these apps itself. So by that, you can then say only allow Microsoft apps to be consumed inside your Microsoft Teams, or you may just allow your third-party or even custom apps. So you can actually allow or block some of these in that kind of combinations there, or maybe just allow specific apps. And that's kind of within your Teams area, if you like, some of the things that you can control. So your channels, moderations, your Teams ownership perspective in terms of your guests or members, but also from a admin center perspective, from all your Microsoft Teams, is obviously your apps and your meeting settings that you have, and that's also your guest access. And then that's kind of the way to think about from a Microsoft Teams perspective. But then what we'll do now is we will kind of step out of Microsoft Teams and go into what we call the Microsoft 365 compliance and then security centers a bit later on. So when we do that, then this is where for your IT staff, for example, this is where some of the skills may be required, and also for some of the business users who may access the Microsoft 365 area. And this is where you have to step out from Microsoft Teams and then go into your Microsoft 365. But before we do that, let's go back to the slides. So we'll look at the compliance manager in a sec when we go to the compliance admin center. But the other thing that I want to kind of cover is the sensitivity labels, and this has been around for a few months now, and especially just last month or two, you're now able to not only just, in addition to classifying your files, but also being able to now classify your entire team or even a SharePoint team site that's connected to it as well. And so the general layout for this, and the way it works, is for every sensitivity label that you create, there's typically two scopes. Either you classify your files and emails, or even your groups and sites with it as well. And so when you do that, you then have the ability to encrypt your files, being able to then mark that content, watermark it, also with auto labeling. But from a group's perspective, you're now then able to control the privacy of that as well as being able to then control whether the external user can access for that particular Teams itself. So I want to just kind of quickly go through that, if I may. But there's a lot of detail to cover, so I won't go every single setting on that. But once you got your label, then obviously you kind of publish your labels with that. Before you enable your groups sites, this is a PowerShell script that you have to run. So this is something you can't do out of the box. So for your normal files that you want to classify, that works great. But if you want to then start introducing your teams and container classifications, if you like, then you've got to go into the Azure AD preview and then be able to create your group settings. Sometimes you'll have issues with that in terms of that it doesn't find that particular group setting. Then you just have to uninstall your Azure AD previews, and then just reinstall those modules. And then you can kind of go through and create your settings and enable your Microsoft information protection labels, and then be able to sync those labels, the ones that are published, so that they become available in your teams. So let's look at that. So if I go to Compliance Center, and so we'll spend a bit of time here, and I'm just going to quickly close that. So if I go into my information protection, which is one of the options you get here, and you can customize this menu through the settings from there as well. But if I go into information protection, then this is where my sensitivity labels live. I've got some examples over here. Typically, I think 4 to 5 should suffice as a starting point, but your departments may vary. So HR, finance, they may have some additional labels, and you can target those to a specific set of users. But I've got one here that I created earlier this week. So if I go into my confidential project label, then let's go and edit that label. So if I go through that, then here I got the option to define that scope, other files and emails, but in this case I've left it as groups and sites. And this is obviously Azure preview that became available last week. So you can now apply, which is still in preview, to your SQL as well as the Azure Synapse area, so that huge area. If I go in here, then I can go and say, do I want to encrypt files? Or in this case, I said I don't want to enable that, so that's why these options are grayed out. Click next, then I've got my options now to be able to enable that for privacy external users access settings. I can also enable for device access and external sharing as well. But once those options are selected, then I get these options to say that if I do create a Microsoft Teams chat space, then what do I want this label to do? So if a user selects confidential project as a label, then I want to make sure that only they are able to create just a private Microsoft Teams chat space and not the public space, not the public one or the organization wide. I can also say that when I do create this Microsoft Teams based on this label, I do not want the owner to add any guests to this particular team. So in this case, I've left that checkbox unchecked. If I then go further into that area, I can then go into this area to be able to control the external sharing. And for those of you who are aware of SharePoint administrators, SharePoint has its own external sharing model compared to the general Microsoft 365 guest access. But here I'm able to then control and say that if this label is selected, then what can I do with those sites? Can I add people to it or anyone for those labeled SharePoint sites, or simply just say only people in this organization can actually have access to that. So therefore, I kind of disable external sharing at this level here. And then, of course, I can also then kind of work out whether I want the users to have full desktop experience to access files within here, or just allow limited web-only access. And there may be certain files you may want to do that. So you have that kind of granularity for those settings that you want to do. And once you've kind of gone through your groups and that external access elements of it, you can then just go ahead and then create that label. Now this normally takes kind of less than a day, if you like, before it takes effect. So I'll kind of just go to my teams now and just show you what that experience looks like. So if I go and create my normal team, like a normal user, so if I go in, I've got my new app templates which became released last few weeks ago, but I'll go and create a team from scratch. And so when I do that, you get your normal options to create the team, give a name, and so forth. But just before quickly loads up, come on. When you try and demo, it always takes longer. But anyways, there it is. So here I got this option here, sensitivity option that's enabled. That pops up. In normal circumstances, you will not get that. But here I've got my two labels that I had published to make it available here. Now, from a user perspective, as long as they know which label to pick, then obviously I can say I'm going to pick confidential project, and here I just get the option to pick only private. I can't do anything here. And if I hover on the information tip, it just says that this is not allowed to create public teams. So then I can just go ahead and create my team there. So I can say this is M365 Bangalore team space. Go ahead and create that. And then once it's done that, great. So it's created that. I can then add my users as I normally go about doing that. Then it just becomes a normal team itself. But one thing to bear in mind here is that just because I've classified this team as a confidential project, it does not mean that every file's contents inside that is going to be confidential project. That is completely separate. So you've still got to classify your files as you see fit to drive that compliance. But this is a way to kind of at least label classified and still be able to apply some of those controls that we just had a look from an external access perspective. So now if I go into my the Bangalore site here, and if I want to try and add a new member, and in this case, I'll try and add my, let's say, Chirag at Microsoft.com. Now, usually it would let me add, and by default here, guest access is on. It would allow me to do that, but here it doesn't even go anywhere further to let me add this user into this team. So from that perspective of that classification, it's completely banned me from entering any third-party guest in here. But if I go into, let's say, Chirag project site here, if I add a member there, so that's just a normal team chat space, is not classified at all. And if I go and add Chirag at Microsoft.com, then it will just go ahead and just let me add that just like that. So I have that flexibility from that sensitivity labels perspective to be able to differentiate some of those things. I can, of course, go and classify that if I wanted to and add that to the confidential project if I want. So that was a kind of a very quick dive, if you like, around the sensitivity labels, and those are some of the screenshots there. You can actually try to drive through that. But also the other area to look at is the DLP side of things, and the data loss prevention side of things has been around for a few years now, and that works in a standard sort of way in order to kind of prevent that information going out, such as in this case the credit card information, for example, for your Teams chats messages. But this is the one I find that you have to really spend more time as opposed to just go and implementing it, because for every DLP policy you create, you're kind of surrounded by those at least 2 rules, and you have to really try and test it out in terms of what conditions you're kind of going through to apply that, but also being able to then working out what actions you want to take. So in this case, do you want to restrict access to those particular files, or being able to then either audit them or even just restrict some of the third-party apps. And so, we'll look at that in a minute, but this is targeted for all your locations, not just Teams and the channel messages, but also your devices, cloud app security, SharePoint, Exchange, and so forth. But the key here is obviously your sensitive information types, which you get a lot of them out of the box available for different countries. So then you can start applying your information types for your users, for your EU or any other information types you have. But also then you can take actions to say, do you want to notify users, or do you want them to override that particular policy? But also being able to control the reports for the incidents to get sent to a combination of people, as well as the additional options for whether you want that rule to stop there and then and prevent from processing further. So let's take a look at that, what that looks like. So if I go into my information protection there, and then if I go into data loss prevention, and I can access these settings in Security Center as well, because there are 2 different centers, compliance and security. But if I go and pick the UK financial data, and let's just edit that policy, just quickly show you some of the specifics on that. Just conscious of time-wise, but I just want to quickly go through this quick. Come on. Right. Okay. So if I just go through this quickly, so I can choose my locations, and in this case, I've got Teams included in that as well. I've got my 2 rules for UK financial data, the conditions that I want to use. So if I go and edit this particular rule, so I've got 2 rules, low, medium, or high volume. Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left.
That's great. Thanks. So if I go and edit my rules in there, then actually I got a comprehensive set of controls and conditions. So I got my conditions there, which is set by those information types there, credit card details and so forth. But also I've got my user notifications, actions if I want to take, either restrict or access or audit them. But also user notifications in terms of, do I want to send that notification to owners and persons and so forth. But also I can then say, if I want to take additional send alerts to admins, then I can choose and add remove people there as well. Or I can choose alerts based on match activities. So this is the one I find that you end up spending so much time just to fine tune that in order to make sure this policy works. And the good thing about this is that you can actually put this in a test mode before you actually go live with this particular policy. So you can test in the test mode to see how that behaves before you sort of target to a small set of users, and then eventually the whole organizations. So I can quickly show you the example that I had there is on the digital assets web. So here's a set of credit card information that I copied earlier in the chat, and then that DLP policy then picks up to say that this message is flagged because it contains that sensitive information. So you have all that raft of controls so that this chat cannot be going out or be accessed by any third-party users. Okay, so just going to go back to slides very quickly. So that's kind of your very quick tour on DLP. And of course, one of the areas for considering in your access to your Teams as well as SharePoint is this, we touched briefly earlier on, that from a Microsoft 365, there's a main switches there you have, whether you allow your users to add guests or just the owners, but also you have your external sharing elements of it as well within SharePoint admin center that you can control, whether that's for a specific domain or all the domains. So you can then go into that further detail, including if you want to have those links to be editable by default or just the read-only there. You've also got the areas of the Microsoft 365 Security Center. So, all very well to implement some of these features, but then the training element is quite important. So there you have the ability to not just having your users, which something Microsoft released a few months ago, but you can also create the attack simulation programs there as well. So to create targeted emails for testing your users out in terms of if they can pick up and respond and phishing emails, for example. So you can actually create tailored programs like that, all within the security center, and target that to your users in a different ways, so that therefore they're constantly being, if you like, exposed to the regular threats of the security from that. So you can do that within the security center as well. But when you look at the, if you like, from here, when you go away, what are your top 12 tasks? And this is recommended by Microsoft. Yes, we kind of, you get your house order in terms of your identity, but also protecting your devices, implementing through that Microsoft Defender 365. And that's obviously, the E5 license implications. Then being able to enroll your PCs through the endpoint manager. So you got all this set of tasks with clear details as to how you can make sure that your staff working from home can actually effectively collaborate securely. And so these are some of the actions you can take. But also, realistically, you can kind of put this in 4 buckets for your Microsoft Teams, depending on what drives the content in your organization. If projects is what you do, it becomes a lot more clearer. But if you've got some teams that has got other data as well, then this hopefully gives you an idea. Again, a slide from Microsoft in terms of how they recommend and how those sensitivity labels you can apply in terms of which can be a public site, team space, all the way down to the highly sensitive information that you may have. So in that case, you may have something like, say, site level block access for highly confidential sites. So you got all those kind of guidelines to kind of take you through in order to kind of at least improve that posture for your security itself. And so that kind of, if you like, brings me the time on the session itself. So here are some resources that hopefully you'll find them useful, and they're all good. I generally find Joanne Klein, which I'm sure some of you may have come across, blogs very good articles in the greatest detail as possible. So do check that out as well. But also it's a very fast growing area for security and compliance. So just keep an eye on the roadmap and everything else that you may find useful for journey in that. But yeah, just with that, I want to say once again thanks to the sponsors and Jasjit, Kamlesh, Nick, Vijay, everyone for making this happen, and to you, the attendees, for joining me. And so hopefully you've taken something away from today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Chirag. We do have one small question here. Any insights on using Microsoft Teams for general public for social startup?
Wow. Microsoft Teams for general social startup. Well, Microsoft Teams, it depends on the context of it. So yes, you can have that for any organization who can sign that up. That's fine. I think the question from a security perspective, depending on what sort of things you may want to hold, may differ based on how much investment you would make to make sure that's kind of a secure area for using Microsoft Teams. But as a short answer, yes, you can. But then you have to really come up with the requirements side of things as to what you intend for your users to do in that.
Exactly. And they should look at it whether it's the right tool and the right fit for this use case scenario as well, right? And
absolutely.
Majority of the scenarios should be covered in this area as such, but yeah, they'll have to be careful in terms of the security configuration and policies. Absolutely.
Yeah. It does. I mean, just kind of adding something to that as well is that, in a way, because some of this has been going on for quite a long time, there's nothing wrong with implementing your Microsoft Teams as long as you've got that basic controls in place. So first and foremost is making sure your Microsoft the multi-factor authentication is enabled. So at least you lock the identity from that perspective, but making sure that how far you go to make sure you have that secure areas of that, because then you got the areas of Power Platform as well. So from a social side of things, if you want to go and store all the details in that Dataverse, for example, all the details, so that all depends where you do that. But yeah, you have to really pick your scenarios as to what you want to do with them.
All right. Thank you so much, Chirag, for the wonderful session. Thank you for your time. And we'll start our next session in another 2 minutes.
Great.